This is Democracy Now!
We should have up to 20 million doses by the end of the year. So as soon as we get approval, General Karna and his teams are going to get hold of the vaccine we have and start shipping it in the country. His goal is to vaccinate Americans within 24 hours from approval.
As Moderna becomes the second company to seek emergency authorization for its COVID-19 vaccine, the CDC is meeting today to decide on who should be first to get the vaccine once one's available. With the pandemic raging across the United States, we'll speak to two African-American doctors who've spent years fighting racial disparities in healthcare. One of them joined Moderna's vaccine study to honor her father, who died from COVID-19. Plus, we'll mark World AIDS Day with Professor Stephen Thrasher.
HIV and AIDS continues to kill too many people. Almost 700,000 people were killed by it last year. And that was decades after effective medication became available. And as we're on the verge of potentially having our coronavirus vaccine to roll out, we have to remember that if we don't have an actively anti-racist, anti-capitalist approach, hundreds of thousands, millions of people will continue to suffer and die.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is convening a panel of advisors today to determine who will be the first in line to be vaccinated against COVID-19 as the U.S. coronavirus outbreak continues to shatter world records. On Monday, U.S. hospitalizations topped 96,000, a record high. There were 168,000 new confirmed cases, nearly 1,300 new deaths Monday. There were over 4 million confirmed U.S. infections in November alone. Here in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo warned of a looming nightmare of overwhelmed hospitals, saying he's prepared to once again close non-essential businesses if cases keep rising. Cuomo also ordered hospitals to call up retired medical workers.
Every hospital has to identify retired nurses and doctors now. We're already experiencing staff shortages. Staff just gets exhausted after a while. They've had a horrendous year.
In California, a new remain-at-home order went into effect across Los Angeles County Monday as Governor Gavin Newsom warned similar orders could soon follow for nearly all of California's 58 counties.
If these trends continue, we're going to have to take much more dramatic, arguably drastic action.
On Monday, President Trump's hand-picked coronavirus advisor, Dr. Scott Atlas, resigned. He's the former Fox News contributor, neuroradiologist from Stanford's conservative Hoover Institution with no expertise in epidemiology or infectious disease. Dr. Atlas's appointment drew condemnation from Stanford's faculty senate, who condemned his comments. Stanford doctors wrote in an LA Times op-ed, quote, "The guidance he is giving to the White House does not reflect sound epidemiological reasoning, nor is it consistent with the current body of scientific knowledge about COVID-19, unquote. President Trump's personal lawyer responded to a doctor's letter from Stanford of about 100 researchers, infectious disease docs, by threatening to sue them for defamation. Dr. Atlas has dismissed overwhelming scientific evidence that face masks slow the spread of coronavirus. He's also pushed a widely discredited strategy of herd immunity through natural infection, a policy that public health officials say could result in the deaths of millions more Americans. Last month, Atlas called on Michiganders to rise up against public health measures aimed at slowing the spread of COVID-19, drawing condemnation from Michigan's Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who was targeted in an alleged terrorist plot by far-right militia members to overthrow the Michigan government and kidnap her. The Government Accountability Office reports millions of U.S. workers left unemployed by the pandemic have been denied the full jobless benefits they're owed, with a majority of states paying out the minimum benefit instead of a higher amount based on workers' prior earnings. The GAO also found weekly Labor Department unemployment figures, which reached historic highs in 2020, have significantly undercounted the number of people out of work. Meanwhile, new research finds more than 400,000 COVID COVID-19 cases and nearly 11,000 deaths resulted from evictions after many states allowed eviction moratoriums to expire over the summer. Emergency room physician Dr. Jason Wilson tweeted in response, "Stable housing is even more important than wearing a mask. Getting out of this pandemic means following all the CDC guidelines, including the one about not evicting people during a global pandemic," unquote. Wisconsin and Arizona have formally certified Joe Biden's win over Donald Trump, dealing the latest blow to Trump's quest to overturn the results of the 2020 election. On Monday, Trump campaign lawyer Joseph DeGeneva said former U.S. cybersecurity chief Chris Krebs, who was fired by Trump after he called the 2020 election the most secure election in American history, should be put to death. DeGeneva was speaking on the Howie Carr Talk radio show.
That guy is a Class A moron. He should be drawn and quartered, taken out at dawn and shot.
This comes as the New York Times and Washington Post are reporting the Trump campaign has raised as much as $170 million since Election Day by appealing to supporters for help with legal challenges. Much of the money will reportedly go into an account for President to use on future political elections, future political activities, or even on himself. One Trump donor, North Carolina businessman Frederick Eshelman, has sued the campaign to recover his $2.5 million donation, citing disappointing results. President Trump continues to lash out at top Republicans who refuse to back his claims of election fraud. On Monday, Trump demanded Georgia Republican Governor Brian Kemp overrule his Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger's certification of Biden's win in Georgia, calling Kemp hapless. Trump also attacked Arizona's Republican Governor Doug Ducey Monday, saying he had, quote, betrayed the people of Arizona, unquote, by certifying Joe Biden's win. This comes as Arizona Democratic Senator-elect Mark Kelly, who defeated Republican incumbent Martha McSally, is set to be sworn in on Wednesday. His victory means the Senate's balance of power will be decided in Georgia's twin runoff elections scheduled for January 5th, when Republican incumbents Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue will face challengers Reverend Raphael Warnock and David Ossoff. Some Georgia Republicans have raised fears Trump's attacks could suppress Republican voter turnout, leading to a Democratic-controlled U.S. Senate. Schools in Baltimore, Maryland are closed for a second day after a ransomware attack shut down much of the school district's computer network. Authorities have revealed few details on what was compromised or if the attacker made any demands. This comes as the New York Times reveals hospitals and other medical institutions are coming under an increasing wave of cyber attacks. A recent attack on the University of Vermont Health Network took down the electronic medical record system for nearly a month, disrupting care for chemotherapy patients and others. In immigration news, a federal court in New York has ordered Immigration and Customs Enforcement to bring immigrants in front of a judge within 10 days of being apprehended. New York immigration rights activists celebrated Monday's ruling, saying it'll protect immigrants' due process rights as ICE can no longer subject them to indefinite detention before hearings related to their case. The ruling only affects New York. In Guatemala, indigenous leaders and thousands of protesters took to the streets of the western region of Sololá on Monday as anti-government actions continued across Guatemala for the second week. Protesters blocked a major highway and surrounding roads for hours. This comes as indignation continues to mount over the government's response to the pandemic and two back-to-back hurricanes, Eta and Iota, which displaced hundreds of thousands of people last month. Many protesters are calling for President Alejandro Giammattei to resign.
He's causing great harm to society, and that's why we demand the resignation of Alejandro Giammattei. Get out, Giammattei.
Thousands of people also led a protest in Guatemala City Saturday with vows to continue mobilizations until the president and other government officials step down. Meanwhile, Amnesty International is condemning the excessive use of force by Guatemalan police against protesters and journalists at a massive action last month triggered by a now retracted budget passed by the Guatemalan Congress, which proposed cuts to health and education. In news from Capitol Hill, a number of major corporations, including Apple, Nike, and Coca-Cola, are opposing a bill to ban goods made using forced labor by Uyghurs and other Muslim minority groups in China's Xinjiang region. The House passed the legislation 406-3, but the Senate has not yet voted. A congressional report earlier this year found many corporations have directly or indirectly relied on forced labor in Xinjiang, including Adidas, Calvin Klein, Campbell's Soup, Costco, H&M, Tommy Hilfiger, Nike, and Patagonia. French politicians have announced they will totally rewrite a controversial new security bill after weeks of nationwide protests. The proposed law would have banned the publication of images of police officers and increased police powers. On Monday, 4 French police officers were charged with assaulting black music producer Michel Zecler while hurling racial epithets at him. Video of the incident went viral at a time when many in France feared the proposed security law would be used to cover up future cases of police brutality. In environmental news, the Brazilian government has confirmed over 2.7 million acres of the Amazon rainforest were destroyed over the past year, the largest amount in 12 years. Deforestation has surged under the right-wing presidency of Jair Bolsonaro. Scientists say preserving the Amazon is crucial in addressing the climate crisis. Construction is set to begin on the new Enbridge Line 3 pipeline after the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency approved the final needed permit on Monday. The controversial proposed pipeline would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Wisconsin, cutting through Indigenous territory in Minnesota, running under more than 200 streams. Indigenous groups have been fighting the project for years. And the winners of the 2020 prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize have been announced. Among this year's winners are Crystal Ambrose from the Bahamas, who pressured the government to ban single-use plastic bags, cutlery and straws, and styrofoam containers and cups. Chibeze Ezekiel from Ghana, the national coordinator of 350 Ghana Reducing Our Carbon. He also works with Ghana's youth climate activists. Namanti Nankimo, an indigenous leader in the Ecuadorian Amazon who led legal action against oil extraction in the region, and Ledi Pesh, an indigenous Maya woman from Opelachen, Mexico, who promotes sustainable development practices for Mayan communities. Pesh is also a beekeeper protecting a rare native bee species. This is Pesh speaking at this year's Goldman virtual ceremony last night.
El premio The
prize gives me the opportunity to tell the world that the lands of the indigenous people are being stripped away by the imposition of mega extraction projects, agro-industry, tourism, and others that strengthen a model of capitalism that threatens natural resources and our way of life.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Juan, it's great to see you.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is meeting today to vote on who should be the first to get the coronavirus vaccine once one's available. This comes as drug makers Pfizer and Moderna are seeking emergency regulatory approval of their vaccines for widespread use, with Pfizer set to be reviewed by the FDA on December 10th. Moderna's review will be a week later. The coronavirus is raging across the United States with 4 million cases in November alone. The pandemic is disproportionately impacting African-American, Latinx, and indigenous communities and exposing long-standing inequities and systemic racism in our healthcare system. These same communities are underrepresented in clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccines, due in part to centuries of abusive treatment at the hands of medical researchers. We're beginning today's show with someone whose work focuses on how systemic racism undermines the health of people of color. She herself participated in Moderna's vaccine trial, in part as a way to honor her late father and to ensure African Americans are included in these studies. Dr. Chris Purnell is a public health physician in Newark, New Jersey, where hospitals in the early days of the pandemic were described as bursting at the seams, with Black and Latinx patients infected with COVID. Around the same time, her father, Timothy Purnell, was hospitalized and tragically died from COVID complications on April 13th. Soon after, her sister Kim, a breast cancer survivor, was diagnosed with COVID. She's still suffering from long-term symptoms. Their father, Timothy Purnell, was recognized by New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, who tweeted about how he, quote, worked his way up from the groundskeeping crew at Bell Labs to becoming a member of the technical staff. For more, Dr. Chris Purnell joins us from Montclair, New Jersey. Dr. Purnell, it's great to have you with us. Our condolences on the death of your father. Can you just take us on the chronology of what happened with your dad, what a remarkable man he was, and then ultimately your decision to be a participant in the Moderna trial?
Sure. Thanks for having me this morning. So if we can think back to the spring when things were just really beginning to explode in New Jersey, in particular in Essex County and centering on North New Jersey, which was unfortunately an epicenter of the pandemic, when hospitals were starting to restrict visitation, when cases were starting to pile up. My dad, unfortunately, got admitted to a local hospital just a mere 4 miles away from where I work. He went in for an unrelated cause. He actually was stable. He was laughing. He was talking about eating his favorite foods. And then suddenly one day he became violently ill. He had vigorous chills, fevers, difficulty breathing, and we were concerned. His medical team was concerned. And after having several of those episodes, unfortunately, he had to be tested, and he tested positive. When my father tested positive, it was very much in the early days of this coronavirus pandemic, when there was little that we knew about how to treat coronavirus, little that we knew about how to sustain life. And unfortunately, we couldn't be there in person with him. I could at best speak with him over the phone, or family members could speak with him virtually. And then he just grew too weak. He grew too tired. I think I last heard my father's voice the Thursday before he died, and he died on a Monday.
And tell us who he was.
Sure. My dad, I tell people, was heroic. I thought he was the bionic man. Here you had a man who came up during the Jim Crow South, who came north during a time that many blacks did, following a migratory pattern, fleeing systemic racism, even the terror of the Jim Crow South, and settled in the North New Jersey and New York area. Ultimately, my father became a research scientist, but not before he took on a host of odd jobs, and one was being a groundsman on the famed Bell Labs campus. My father always had a knack for math and science, but college wasn't a possibility for him in the 1950s in Richmond, Virginia. And so one fateful day led to another fateful opportunity. And my dad was self-taught. He would read textbooks at night. He would go to classes provided at the lab by some of the PhD scientists. And he assumed the research throne, I like to say. He was a part of definitely groundbreaking work at Bell Labs. And more importantly, he fought and he advocated for blacks to have equal opportunities and access to fields in research.
And Dr. Purnell, your father was not the only member of your family afflicted by the coronavirus. Could you talk about the experiences of other family members and then your decision to participate in the vaccine trial?
Sure. I've been saying clearly, it is so important to put a face to this pandemic. It is so important to put a face to the science. When we talk about how coronavirus has disproportionately impacted Black and brown lives, I oftentimes point to my own story. So here, the week where we buried my father through a virtual ceremony, my sister was confirmed positive with coronavirus. My sister, who is a breast cancer survivor, works in an essential retail industry and likely got exposed on her job, became sick. She wasn't hospitalized, but she was sick at home. We closely monitor her. And here, what almost 8 or 9 months later, my sister still has lingering after effects of the infection. She just got off of supplemental oxygen. She has not yet returned to work. So that's that disproportionate impact. And even this past Sunday, unfortunately, I lost another relative. I lost a beloved cousin to coronavirus who suffered a catastrophic stroke.
And then in terms of your decision to participate in the trial?
Sure. You know, my father's death, what I saw my sister go through, what I saw the patients at our safety net hospital in Newark encounter and deal with, and being a public health physician, I needed a way to be a part of the solution. You could say it put a fire in my belly. I believe in public health science, obviously, as a public health physician, and I wanted a way to be a part of that science. My dad would frequently say to me, he would say, follow the science, follow the data. And an opportunity was made available. Our hospital, in conjunction with a local academic medical institution, was a sponsoring site. So I was able to volunteer, and I did not hesitate at that opportunity. I knew what was known at that time from phase 1 research, and I knew also that no serious medical events had happened in phase 2, and I knew it was important for Black and brown persons to participate if we were ever to get at a truly effective solution.
And can you talk about, were there effects, side effects? People are describing feeling sick for a day or two. I mean, it is astounding, Dr. Purnell, that with your dad who's died, with your sister who's a long hauler, that you were willing to go through this even as you treat COVID patients.
So let me talk about that. So I'm not a frontline provider. I work in leadership, but I'm definitely a part of an institution caring for those frontline patients. But I would say to you, I had to do something, right? I saw my community decimated, and understanding the legacy of systemic racism. That's why this pandemic has disproportionately impacted Black and brown lives. I needed a way to say, can we get at an effective solution to beat back this pandemic? So I enrolled. I am very much aware of the legacy of medical experimentation, the legacy of medical exploitation, but this was an opportunity to be a part of something that was rooted in sound ethical practice and upheld informed consent. And so when I got my first injection at the end of August, I could tell you it felt like when I got my flu vaccine, right? I had local pain or soreness at the injection site. I did have some headaches and things of that nature, but nothing too out of the ordinary or nothing that was concerning from my baseline. In addition to that first injection, I had the second injection in the very early days of October. That experience was a little bit different. I can tell you that day, by the end of that day that I got that injection, I felt extreme fatigue. I was telling this story. I felt like I couldn't get out of my car. I just felt overcome with excessive fatigue. In addition to that, I had a more severe headache. But I can tell you those symptoms didn't last longer than 24 to about 36 hours. And for me, it was worth it. I don't know if I was in the placebo arm or if I was in the active vaccine candidate arm. But the experiences I've had to date, they've been worth it.
And Dr. Purnell, could you talk about some of the historic barriers to getting people of color, particularly African Americans, to want to participate in vaccine trials? There's a natural skepticism because, as you mentioned, of the legacy of previous experiments done on people of color.
Sure. We can go back to slavery when Dr. Sims was doing gynecological procedures on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. Without their consent. They weren't even considered human beings. We could talk about how Black bodies were robbed from cemeteries out of that Civil War era to allow medical students to learn anatomy and dissection. We could talk about the unfortunate and infamous experience of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where we had a treatment for syphilis, but that was withheld to study the natural progression of the disease in Black men. We could talk about Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman in segregated Baltimore who had metastatic cervical cancer and had tissue samples taken from her womb unknowingly that have become one of the most productive cell lines that have led to groundbreaking research. We could talk about Mississippi appendectomies, where we're describing where Black and brown women have undergone forced sterilizations under the guise of something else. There are a host of examples in the literature, in the lived experience that is weighed on the collective psyche of the Black and brown community. But in addition to what's happened in the past, we in healthcare, I describe it as we're still grappling with systemic racism, right? We're still grappling with inequities that lead to staggering healthcare disparities, whether it is disproportionate disease prevalence rates, or whether it is implicit bias that impacts provider and patient interactions. There is a truth that we cannot deny. And I'm very, very well cognizant of that truth. And my work centers on health equity and health justice. So it's so important as we go into community and we talk about what tools we do have to beat back this pandemic, and clinical research being one of them, which has gotten us to the point where we have 2 vaccine candidates applying for emergency use authorization. We have to center that conversation in transparency and authenticity. And then we have to demonstrate trustworthiness, we in academic medicine, we in healthcare, so that we can win back, that we can cultivate trust in these communities that have been historically excluded and disadvantaged.
And Dr. Purnell, we're going to ask Dr. Monica Peek this question as well in a minute at the University of Chicago. But your thoughts on what's being proposed now to increase participation, and that is paying people to take the vaccine. I think John Delaney, the former Democratic presidential candidate, former congressman from Maryland, is proposing something like $1,000, $1,500. Your thoughts on this?
I'm against that. I'm against that because I think that's an unfair inducement. Having a financial incentive such as that, the people who would be most sensitive to that are those who are struggling with poverty. And we can't have any shortcuts. We just have to do the hard work. And the hard work is demonstrating trustworthiness. The hard work is beating back the misinformation and the disinformation and hearing people's fears and concerns and allowing science to listen with an empathetic ear, and then to demonstrate why this is the right choice, why this is so necessary to improve our communities. I don't think paying people is the way to go about it. I think actually that is a shortchanged result that doesn't center itself in a health equity approach.
Chris Purnell, we thank you so much for being with us. Public health physician in Newark, New Jersey, Moderna vaccine trial participant. Thanks for being with us. Next up, we'll continue to discuss the COVID vaccines as drug makers press for emergency approval and the debate over whether people should be paid to take those vaccines. As well, the CDC now considering today who should get the millions of vaccines that will probably be made available in the next weeks. Stay with us. The Firewood Collector by Bernard Kabanda, the late Ugandan musician, died of AIDS. Today is World AIDS Day. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue to look at the coronavirus pandemic spike here in the U.S. and how the vaccine will be distributed as the CDC prepares to meet today to vote on who should be the first to get the vaccine once it's available. As distribution draws near, a recent poll suggests 42% of Americans are reluctant to take the vaccine. In response, some, including the former Maryland congressman and former presidential candidate John Delaney, are pushing to pay people to get vaccinated. This is Delaney on CNN responding to criticism that the plan would cause an undue burden on people who are economically disadvantaged.
Those who are least economically so among us have suffered disproportionately under this pandemic. So many of those people are not sitting at home and Zooming into work. They're actually getting on public transportation, going to grocery stores, and making sure the essential things that we all need are available. They're the people who will benefit the most from getting the vaccination rate up.
Well, for more on vaccine distribution, we're joined by Dr. Monica Peek, a physician, associate professor of medicine and health disparities researcher at the University of Chicago. She is meeting at the university today to determine how the university will roll out the vaccine there. In Chicago, like other cities across the country, those killed by COVID-19 have been disproportionately African-American and Latinx. Dr. Peek, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Why don't you start off by responding to what the former congressman is proposing? If there is a problem with people being concerned about the vaccine, pay them to take it.
No. I agree with Dr. Purcell in that we should separate the two issues of economic need and the issue of vaccine implementation, because we don't want the perception of vaccine safety and trust in the vaccine to cloud the waters of economic need. And so it is really important that people are able to look at the science, that people are able to follow the words of the scientists and the public health professionals and say, this is something that is safe, that I believe in, that the trusted professionals are recommending that I take, and that they're not saying this is something that financially I need to do, and I think there might be more risks associated with it because I'm having to be paid to take it. But because I'm so broke, I'm going to put my body in harm's way in order to get this money. We don't want people feeling like they have to make that choice. So we need to be able to disentangle those two things and make sure that we have given the people the stimulus that they need. Those conversations are in gridlock. That needs to, fix itself. We need to come to agreement about how to make sure that we are financially supporting the people that are in this economic crisis. Separately, we need to figure out how we're going to be able to ensure that we have the trust needed to vaccinate our entire U.S. population. Everyone's got to get vaccinated quickly. And so those are two separate conversations.
And on this issue, Dr. Peek, of the getting everyone vaccinated, clearly there will have to be steps, and the decisions that are being made today in terms of priorities at the federal level. How does this, even at your university or at the local level, how do the health professionals, what kind of things do they think about in terms of after the first responders, the people in the healthcare system, who gets it next?
Well, there are millions of people that need this vaccine. And so a lot of thought has been going into how to fairly allocate the vaccine way before we knew that the vaccines would even be ready. So it's a miracle that we have two that are coming on the market this quickly. And so the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine had been meeting already for months and has come up with recommendations. The CDC is currently meeting. Individual hospitals are coming up with their individual rollout plans. But the general consensus is that people who are frontline workers, people who are considered frontline healthcare workers, high-risk healthcare workers, people who are essential workers, those who are sick, have chronic medical problems, those who are living in close quarters, congregate facilities like nursing homes, homeless shelters, prisons, people that are elderly, all of these sort of high-risk populations, for whatever reason, based on your job, where you're living, how sick you are, those are the populations that need to be vaccinated early. K through 12 teachers. We need to be able to get people back into school, into settings where they can be close together. And so there's a phased rollout where we have, a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, so that we can sort of in an orderly fashion figure out who's going to go first. And ultimately get to make sure that everyone in the population goes. And so right now, we're trying to think about just phase 1A, which is high-risk health workers and first responders. And so assuming that things happen on time and December 10th, the first vaccine is made available and starts being shipped out, then the hospitals are beginning to look inwardly and think about how we're going to vaccinate our own hospital employee population. So where I am, we have about 6,500 employees, a little more than that. And so we think that we can vaccinate everybody in a week. So if we did 1,000 vaccinations a day, then we could get everyone done within a week's time. And so we are sort of looking at that kind of time frame.
And when we talk about, for instance, first responders and folks in healthcare facilities, I'm assuming that, for instance, in a hospital that includes not just the nurses and the doctors and but also the maintenance staff and the kitchen workers and all the other people that are part of that hospital complex. Is that true? That is true. Everybody in the hospital is potentially exposed. And we think about when you are a patient in the hospital, someone is coming in to clean your room. Someone is coming in to deliver your food. Someone's coming in to take your temperature. There are many people that come in and out of that door, deliver magazines, who are not your nurse or your physician, but have contact with you. There are people who are changing your bed linens and that are, having contact with soiled, contaminated, infectious products. And so everybody needs to be protected. We are all in this together. And so the hospital is a bubble that we're all in, and we are all at risk. And so, yes, hospital workers means all hospital workers.
As we were just talking with Dr. Chris Purnell about the use of experimentation, especially on the African-American community, medical experimentation, one of your specialties is racial disparities. And I had two questions. This isn't related just to disparities. You said everyone could be vaccinated in a week, but these are a two-part vaccine. So there's this question of will they use all the 40 million or so vaccines all at once and then wait for the next ones to be developed? Or will they only use 20 million of them so you can get the second vaccine in whatever that period is? And if you can talk about whether it conveys immunity or you can actually get sick, but you will be asymptomatic and you can still spread it, all these questions about the vaccine. But then also, in the wider population, since that's what you deal with also outside of the University of Chicago, workers at the meatpacking plants, farm workers, people who are undocumented. How do we ensure that they all have equal access?
These are excellent questions and difficult questions, but ones that we are going to have to think about how we have a system in place to roll out implementation. And so already it shows that this is not something that hospitals in and of themselves are going to do. The vaccines are primarily going to be shipped to health departments, and then health departments then parcel them out to different institutions. And so in some cases, hospitals will be working alongside other kinds of organizations to make sure that populations are effectively vaccinated. And so certainly we are used to caring for patients. And so we'll be, caring for our own patients who are medically vulnerable and making sure that they get vaccinated. But some people, not everyone has a primary care physician. Many people exist, unfortunately, without routine care. But we need to make sure that everyone in this country is vaccinated. And so we're going to have to think about non-healthcare sites for vaccination, just like we're doing for COVID testing, where we have pop-up testing sites. We're going to have to be more creative in how we think about reaching populations that don't ordinarily show up at our doors for care, and to ensure that we are reaching everyone for vaccine delivery.
And Dr. Peek, I wanted to ask you, given the fact that the vaccine will be rolled out probably right around the time that the deaths and the hospitalizations from the virus are at record levels, there's going to be enormous pressure by sectors of the population to get the vaccine. I'm thinking over the last 9 months, there's a whole section of the American public that has had the ability to work remotely from home and therefore protect themselves, whereas those workers who have to go to work every day have been increasingly the ones most exposed. So shouldn't the vaccine then be rolled out to those who are being forced to work every day as a result of the kind of jobs that they have? And won't there be pressure from those who are generally more professional, more middle class, who have stayed at home all these 9 months to also get the vaccine? How do you monitor? What's going to be the monitoring process to make sure there's not abuses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I am unaware of sort of the teeth or the penalties for people jumping in line and trying to abuse the system. But what we have tried to put in place are parameters and a rollout system so that, think about a buffet line on a cruise ship or something. So now we're taking people who are having the blue cards. These are the people who are due to get vaccinated. This week we're doing everyone who's a healthcare employee. Next week we're doing, essential workers for the next month. And how we're going to figure out exactly how we find those people and whatever we're, those are the plans and implementation policies and things we're going to have to be working through in conjunction with, city planners. And this is where the rubber hits the road and all of the infrastructure and planning has to, start working and has been working. But essential workers that are keeping our cities and townships functioning, they're high up on the list. They're part of the phase 2. And so, again, people who are performing critical functions for the city, as well as people who are carrying higher burdens of disease, are priority people. Frequently, those are the same people because people who have been burdened by oppression, by structural inequities and racism, that has affected their health. And the same structural inequities has meant that they have had limited opportunities as far as education and career advancement. So a lot of times they're more likely to be working in essential worker jobs. And so many of the people who that we're talking about being high priorities for a medical reason or for an occupational reason are the same people. And so those people may have multiple reasons to be priority individuals for getting vaccinated.
And Dr. Monica Peek, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves here. I mean, you have Stephen Hahn, head of the FDA, the doctor who's been called to the White House because Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, who also came down with COVID, as did President Trump. Of course, the White House is a hot spot because of the herd immunity approach President Trump has taken, putting pressure on him to speed up the approval process. It'll be going to the FDA, but then it has to be approved by the CDC. This has been done at unbelievable speed, which is both the excellent news, but also a concern for people. Is this being approved with the kind of scientific review that something like this, distributed on a mass basis, needs? Are you concerned about that? Overall, the speed with which this is being done, and the fact that even before January 20th, as everyone looks at that next inauguration day, you have tens of thousands of Americans who will die. And what President Trump needs to be doing right now outside the virus, outside the vaccine, to ensure that people have access to masks and tests, something that continues to be a massive problem in this country.
Yes. So much you just said right there. So where to start? I guess the easy answer is thinking about the current administration. Given that Trump has been in office for 4 years, and we've seen what he can and cannot do, and we've seen how he has handled and approached the COVID pandemic, I don't have high hopes that his behavior will change between now and January 20th. The best that I can hope for is that he will step out of the way in enough way to make room for the incoming Biden administration and the transition team to be able to make some headway. Biden has, the first thing he did was pull together his COVID-19 task force, which is, chocked full of scientists, health policy analysts, public health professionals, people who are very experienced in, vaccine policy, and know what they're doing. And so getting these people together who have already been thinking about COVID for years, well, not for years, but, infectious disease for years, and have been thinking about the COVID pandemic since it started, that is where we need to be able to let these people flourish in this space and have access to some resources. But I do think that talking about just the rapidity with which these vaccines have moved forward, you're right in that it's a good thing. And then there's some ambivalence there. We want things to move as quickly as possible, as long as it's safe. We want them to move with the speed of light as long as the science is there, and for them not to have been politically approved, but for them to have been scientifically approved. And so that's the fine line that we want to walk. And so when all the scientists have come together behind the idea of, Project Warp Speed, that has been so far an effective scientific endeavor. And so we want that kind of scientific collaboration to continue. But what we don't want is politicians getting in the mix and saying, I really need this to happen to ensure my reelection, or, things that worry the public. And we know that these things have worried the public. And so we cannot undermine, or we have already undermined, we cannot continue to undermine and erode the public trust in this process. We need to have the public trust that this vaccine will be safe, and we cannot cut corners, because once the vaccine is here, if no one is willing to take it, all of this effort will have been for naught. So we can't, speed things up just to get here, and then no one's willing to use it. So we have to, as Dr. Purcell was saying, do the hard work. We have to do it right. We have to think right now in advance about how we're going to make this vaccine acceptable to communities who are thinking that this is something that I'm not interested in, and be engaging right now in campaigns of truth-telling. We have to be engaging with organizations that we know are trustworthy. Rather than tearing down the CDC, we need to be building up that public health infrastructure, reinvesting in the CDC, giving them back the leadership and the ability to tell truth to the public, and giving them back, the right to run the ship.
Dr. Monica Peek, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Physician, Associate Professor of Medicine and Health Disparities Research at the University of Chicago. There is so much to talk about, and we will get back to you soon. Again, next up, it's World AIDS Day. We'll speak with Professor Stephen Thrasher in 30 seconds. Antonio Veracruz, a gay icon in Paraguay who died from HIV/AIDS in 1984. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Today is World AIDS Day. As the world waits on an effective COVID-19 vaccine and the U.S. sees skyrocketing cases that shatter every world record, we turn now to look at the ongoing AIDS epidemic and how the coronavirus has threatened treatment for those living with HIV. Around 33 million lives have been lost to AIDS in the past 4 decades. This is the head of the World Health Organization speaking Monday.
There is some evidence that people living with HIV may have an increased risk of severe disease and death from COVID-19. This increased risk has been compounded by disruptions to treatment for people living with HIV. In a WHO survey of 127 countries earlier this year, more than a quarter reported partial disruption to antiretroviral treatment for people with HIV.
Well, for more, we go to Chicago to speak with Stephen Thrasher, professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, author of the forthcoming book, The Viral Underclass, How Racism, Ableism, and Capitalism Plague Humans on the Margins. His new piece is out in Scientific American. It's headlined, World AIDS Day is a grim reminder that we have more than one pandemic going on. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Professor Thrasher. Talk about that more than one pandemic and what today means.
Thank you, Amy. According to the World Health Organization, there are actually about 20 pandemics going on that include, of course, COVID-19, Zika, and HIV/AIDS. And HIV/AIDS has continued to kill way too many people. Almost 700,000 people died last year. As I write about in my piece, the sort of good news, as good as that kind of devastating news can be, is that it's declined a great deal. But we really risk, as the clip was just saying a moment ago, we risk the possibility that that could go back up. And what's really concerning to me, as the previous 2 doctors were speaking about vaccination coming out, is that a pharmacological intervention alone is not going to get us out of the death and destruction we're seeing. There have been very effective medications for HIV for the past quarter of century, and yet tens of millions of people have died since that time. The problem is not just the drugs, it's the conditions around people's lives that lead them to become affected by viruses.
And could you explain that, why, despite the antiretroviral drugs that have come on the scene over these 25 years or so, that rates of AIDS continue to increase?
Yeah, so in a word, the problem is capitalism. The drugs work. We have to get them to people. And it's not just a matter of getting the drugs to people. It's that the whole conditions of their life have to be life-sustaining and valuable. So there's a fantastic paper that I'm citing in my piece by Emily Benfer and a number of co-authors in the Journal of Urban Health, and it writes about the connection. They write about the connection between eviction and COVID-19, that evicting people from their homes is creating an increased amount of COVID-19 transmission. And something very similar has happened with HIV and AIDS. The viruses transmit very differently, but they affect similar populations because people are subject to the same overall terrible conditions. So if somebody doesn't have a home, if somebody is homeless and doesn't have employment, they don't have health insurance, they're not going to be able to get HIV medication. And HIV meds work. For the populations that got them, they not only save the life of the person, they keep them from transmitting the virus onward, and that way they sort of act like a vaccination. But certain populations never really got the drugs. And as I'm writing about in my book, according to CDC data in 2015, the rate of AIDS for Black America was actually slightly higher than it had ever been for white America before there were any drugs at all. And that was after there had been drugs around for about 20 years. So if we're only depending upon drugs to address a crisis, it's not going to help the people who are most at risk.
And I'm wondering if you could extrapolate that the issue of racial disparities around HIV/AIDS and how they have emerged or continue to develop in terms of the coronavirus, because already, obviously, the coronavirus from the very beginning was afflicting African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans at much higher rates than white Americans.
Well, certainly. So to look at only one variable that's an easy one to understand what's happening is to look at the issue of who is unhoused in America. White people are the majority of people in the United States still, and they are a minority of those who are unhoused. African Americans are only about 13% of the population and are a majority of the unhoused. And so everything that comes along with not having a home, being policed, not having health access, jobs, ending up in the informal economy where you're more likely to be arrested and sexually assaulted. All of that is one of the reasons why HIV is more prevalent amongst African Americans. And if you don't get the drugs, then the virus will concentrate in a certain population. And now we're seeing something very similar happening with COVID-19. People who don't have the structural support that they need for a healthy life, who are not able to work from home, who are not able to live with space. Some of it's just kind of mathematics. If you look at how influenza moved before and how much square footage people need. Latinx people, Native Americans, African Americans have less living space. And when they're more likely to be evicted, which is one of the brilliant things about this paper, is that when people are evicted, sometimes they end up on the street, but usually the first stop is that they end up doubling up with other people. And so the households get even more dense and there's more COVID transmission likely to be happen. And that's what we're really seeing with Latinx, Black, and Native American communities now, is that as they are more likely to be evicted, as they're more likely to lose work in the COVID-19 pandemic, they're living in denser populations and denser homes with other people who are more likely to be frontline workers and more likely to be exposed in the service industry and not have jobs where they can work from home.
I wanted to ask you quickly before we end about the nomination of Neera Tanden. President-elect Biden has nominated two women of color in key economic positions, Cecilia Rouse, a Princeton labor economist, to chair the Council of Economic Advisors, and Neera Tanden, head of the Center for American Progress, as director of the Office of Management and Budget. She would be the first woman of color and first South Asian woman in the role. But many progressives object to her playing a role in the incoming administration, citing Cap's cozy relationship with corporate funders, her record of antagonizing and undermining progressive Democrats, and her hawkish foreign policy positions. Also has come under criticism for her support of slashing Social Security. Can you comment on the nomination of Neera Tanden to head OMB?
Well, I understand why progressives are upset, and I was very upset because she represents what a lot of us are frustrated with the Democratic Party, that the people that they're responding to are not the majority of Americans. They're responding to Wall Street. They're responding to pharmacological producers, and those are the kind of people that want to keep drugs high and think that the profit on drugs for HIV, potentially for COVID-19, is more important than actually saving people's lives. And I think that when we're looking at other people of color, I'm very honored to be on the show with Dr. Purnell and Dr. Peek. We have to look at people who have an active commitment to racial justice and ending healthcare disparities. That does not apply to everyone who's coming into the cabinet. And I don't want someone like Neera Tanden not taking into account that we must keep people from being unhoused. They have to have healthcare access. Otherwise, how are they going to get access to a vaccination that has to be given over 2 or 3 doses over weeks?
Finally, 10 seconds. Do you see Medicare for All as a racial justice solution?
Absolutely.
Well, Stephen Thrasher, I want to thank you for being with us, professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, faculty member of Northwestern's Institute of Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Well-Being. We'll link to his piece in Scientific American just out today. World AIDS Day is a grim reminder that we have more than one pandemic going on. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamara Studio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe. Wear a mask.